Hello everyone, this is TheHistoriographer. Today, in collaboration with Stoic historian and TsarIvan, we will explore the fascinating life and times of the man that nearly brought the world to nuclear annihilation, a revolutionary that exported communism worldwide, the man known as El Comandante, who was targeted over 600 times by the CIA in failed assassination attempts, becoming a recurrent nightmare for Uncle Sam. Meet Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro was born on August 13, 1926, near the city of Biran in eastern Cuba. He was the third of 6 children, including his famous 2 brothers, Raúl and Ramón. His father was a wealthy sugar plantation owner originally from Spain, mostly doing lucrative business with the American-owned United Fruit Company, which was a dominant agricultural force in the Caribbean and Central America at the time. Being educated in private Jesuit schools, Castro grew up in wealthy circumstances, thanks to his father's business despite the overall poverty of Cuba. From an early age, Castro showed intellectual prowess, yet he was more interested in sports than studies. Nevertheless, Castro completed his secondary studies in 1945, hence enabling him to enter law school at the famed University of Havana. There, Castro was introduced early on to the complex world of politics. Admitting he was quote-unquote politically illiterate, Fidel became a voracious reader, immersed in the climate of Cuban politics, dominated by a mixture of Cuban nationalism, anti-imperialism, and socialism. By 1947, Castro, who was in his early 20s, had become progressively passionate about social justice and populist causes. For example, he traveled to both the Dominican Republic and Colombia in 1947 and 48 to partake in anti-government actions and protests. He also joined the Big Tent party Partido Ortodoxo, initially a centrist to left-wing political party founded to reform government in Cuba by means of mostly socialist policies. The party's chief and founder, Cuban presidential candidate Eduardo Chivas, lost the 1948 presidential election, but he inspired Castro, both by his energetic speeches and charisma, to be his disciple, hence gaining much experience in the art of politics. Castro's marriage to his fellow student Mirta Diaz, who hailed from a wealthy political family in Cuba, exposed Castro to the wealthier lifestyle of the island's upper classes, all while giving the young Castro new political connections. During the same time, Castro had developed a stark interest for the world of Karl Marx, which increasingly infiltrated the Partido Ortodoxo, and he began to interpret Cuba's problems due to the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie rather than the failing of corrupt politicians, and slowly beginning to adopt the view that meaningful political change could only be brought about by the proletariat revolution. As for Castro's ally Chivas, despite losing the 1948 election, the populist leader pledged to expose the government's corruption and warned the people of Cuba about the ambitious general Fulgencio Batista, a former president who was plotting a return to power by all means. Yet, all warnings fell on deaf ears. As a result of political pressure, in 1951, Chivas shot himself, and just a year later, in March 1952, the inevitable had occurred. Indeed, a coup led by General Fulgencio Batista with the support of the United States successfully overthrew the ruling government of President Carlos Prio, and the upcoming 1952 election was cancelled, leaving Castro powerless, effectively without a legitimate political platform to voice his opinions, and essentially with no income with which to support his family. In the subsequent months, Batista set himself up as the dictator of Cuba, and solidified his iron grip over the island country with crushing military rule. Cuba's economic elite and the US had his government recognized, and they worked hand in hand to enrich the already wealthy upper class and serve foreign interests, mainly America's, at the expense of the already poverty-stricken lower classes, comprised majoritarily of sugar plantation farmers. In response, Castro and fellow members of the Partido Ortodoxo, now a radicalized party with increasing left-wing and communist tendencies, organized the group they called the Movement and planned a rebellion. On the fate-changing day of July 26, 1953, Castro and nearly 150 of his comrades infamously attacked the Moncada military barracks outside of Santiago de Cuba in an attempt to overthrow Batista. However, the attack failed. Castro was captured and he was sentenced to 15 years in prison. While incarcerated, Castro renamed his group the 26th of July movement and continued to coordinate its activities through clandestine correspondence. In a rather disastrous political move by Batista, Castro and his compatriots were released in 1955 under an amnesty deal. This allowed Castro to travel with his brother Raúl to Mexico, where they meticulously continued to plan for their impending revolution. In Mexico, Castro met with other Cuban exiles, as well as the soon-to-be famous Argentinian rebel Che Guevara, an uncompromising communist revolutionary who, via his explorations in Latin America, believed that the plight of Latin America's poor could only be ended through means of violent revolution. Sharing the same goals, Che joined Castro's group and became an important confidante, helping Castro to shape his political beliefs. On December 2, 1956, Castro returned to Cuba with a mere 80 insurgents aboard the famous ship the Granma, landing on southern Cuba near the city of Manzanillo. While Batista's forces killed or captured most of the attackers, Castro, Raúl, Guevara, and a handful of others were able to escape into the Sierra Maestra mountain range along the island's southern coast, where over the course of the next 2 years, Castro's steadily growing forces waged a highly successful guerrilla campaign against the increasingly repressive Batista government by organizing resistance groups in cities and small towns all across Cuba. Thanks to Castro's political skills, as well as the disliked Batista regime, Castro was also able to organize his own parallel government, even carry out some agricultural reform, and control the held province's agriculture and industry. Yet, the guerrilla war would not last long. Seeing a demoralized opponent, and beginning in 1958, Castro and his forces undertook a historic feat of military campaigns to capture and hold key areas throughout Cuba. Due to a massive loss of popular support as a result of his brutal policies, low military morale, and significant desertions, Batista and his government finally collapsed under Castro's immense pressure, and in January 1959 fled to the Dominican Republic. At the young age of 32, Castro had successfully concluded his military campaign to take control of Cuba. A provisional government was created, quickly gaining the recognition of foreign powers. Rapidly, Castro arrived in Havana to cheering crowds and assumed the post of commander-in-chief of the military. Later that year, Fidel was sworn in as Cuba's prime minister, where he executed thousands of his political foes in front of public trials.
As the new de facto leader of Cuba, Fidel implemented revolutionary reforms by nationalizing factories and plantations to try to end U.S. economic dominance on the island. As a result, American companies were negatively affected, hence leading to a strain in relations between Cuba and the White House. During this time, Castro consistently denied being communist, despite the fact that his government policies resembled a Soviet-style control. Indeed, the commander-in-chief's government signed the notable First Agrarian Reform Act, which basically led to state land control where the farmers became but mere government workers. By the end of 1959, Castro's revolution had become more radicalized, with purges of military and government leaders, including the puppet president, Urrutia, and the suppression of any media critical of Castro's policies, thus firmly establishing the revolutionary as the main strongman on the tropical Atlantic island. Crucially, Fidel's government began to establish relations with America's arch-nemesis, the Soviet Union. For example, in 1960, Cuba signed a trade agreement to buy oil from the Soviet Union, as well as to establish diplomatic relations. When U.S.-owned refineries in Cuba refused to process the oil, Castro nationalized them. Washington retaliated by slashing Cuba's vital import quota on the profitable sugar market, hence beginning what would become a decades-long troubled relationship between the two countries, where the U.S. would try to get rid of Fidel, the thorn of its vulnerable side, a thorn just a handful of miles away from the Floridian coast, with hundreds of assassination attempts. The year, 1961, was pivotal in Castro's relationship with Uncle Sam. This was because, in January of that year, U.S. President Eisenhower annulled any and all diplomatic relations with the Cuban government. In response, Castro formally declared Cuba a socialist state. By April of 1961, the newly elected JFK reluctantly approved a prearranged plan by his predecessor that would go down in history as one of America's most embarrassing scandals, the Bay of Pigs invasion. Indeed, some 1,400 American-trained Cuban exiles invaded Cuba at the remote Bay of Pigs location in an attempt to overthrow El Comandante's regime. The expedition resulted in a fiasco, with hundreds of the attackers being killed by the higher-motivated Cuban revolutionary forces, while the rest were taken prisoner. The United States denied any involvement, yet declassified documents revealed decades later confirmed that the insurgents were trained by the CIA. Ever the opportunist, Castro capitalized on the incident to consolidate his power with Cuba. For example, the Comandante announced an end to democratic elections in Cuba, denounced American imperialism, and, to add insult to injury, Castro declared himself a Marxist-Leninist and announced that the Cuban government was adopting communist economic and political policies. Essentially, Fidel's Cuba became a communist bulwark just a few miles from the shores of the capitalist hegemon, the U.S. In retaliation, in early 1962, the Kennedy administration imposed a complete economic embargo on Cuba. Post the Bay of Pigs incident, Castro increased relations with the Soviet Union by accepting further economic and military aid. As a result, in October 1962, the world was driven to the brink of nuclear war. Hoping to halt efforts at another U.S. invasion of Cuba and to respond to U.S. Jupiter missiles that were placed in Turkey, Castro and the then Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev decided to place nuclear missiles capable of striking all of the mainland U.S., barring Washington state, in Cuba. When an American U-2 reconnaissance plane discovered a missile-based construction site, sheer panic spread in the White House, and President Kennedy responded by demanding the removal of all the missiles. For over 13 nerve-wracking days of back-channel communications between Khrushchev and Kennedy and their agents, where the world came to a button's press away from total nuclear war and annihilation, the Soviets agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for the United States' agreement not to invade Cuba. Similarly, the Kennedy administration also agreed to secretly remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey. While both leaders saved some face, Castro, on the other hand, was humiliated. Truly, both superpowers had completely left him out of the negotiations. The United States would further rub salt in Castro's fresh wound by successfully persuading the Organization of American States to end diplomatic relations with Cuba, in response to Castro's so-called shameful actions. However, the indomitable spirit of Castro would help him rise from the ashes, and he began to take several steps to export communist ideas, in direct defiance to the U.S. Firstly, in 1965, he merged Cuba's Communist Party with his revolutionary organizations, installing himself as the head of the party. Secondly, he began a worldwide campaign of supporting armed struggle against imperialism in Latin America and African countries. Thirdly, in 1966 and 67, Castro founded various revolutionary organizations to promote anti-imperialist ideas across the world. Fourthly, in the 1970s, Castro continued to promote pro-Soviet forces in Angola, where Cuban forces would even directly intervene against anti-communist and South African forces in Ethiopia and in Yemen. Yet, in the grand scheme of things, said expeditions proved unsuccessful and put an unnecessary strain on the Cuban economy. Castro had been credited with opening 10,000 new schools and improving literacy rates to nearly 98%. Till today, Cubans enjoy a universal healthcare system with qualified medical staff, which has decreased infant mortality to 11 deaths in 1,000. But at the same time, civil liberties were nearly erased, as labor unions lost the right to strike, independent newspapers were shut down, and religious institutions were harassed. Castro removed opposition to his rule through executions and imprisonments, as well as through forced emigration. During Castro's rule, hundreds of thousands of Cubans left or were exiled from the country, many settling just across the Florida Straits in Miami, which harbors a large Cuban diaspora. The largest of these exoduses occurred in 1980, when Castro opened up the port of Mariel. All in all, nearly 120,000 Cubans left their homeland in 1980 to find sanctuary in the United States.
After the 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba's economy went into a spiral, and Castro's revolution efforts began to lose momentum. Without cheap oil imports and an eager Soviet market for Cuban sugar and other goods, Cuban unemployment and inflation grew. Yet Castro was very adept at keeping control of the government during dire economic times. He pressed the United States to lift the economic embargo, but they refused. Castro then adopted a quasi-free market economy and encouraged international investment by, among others, promoting tourism. He also legalized the U.S. dollar, and in 1996 he visited the United States to invite Cuban exiles living there to return to Cuba and start businesses. The suffocating economic sanctions caused various goods, electricity, and oil shortages, further worsening the country's economy. With the fuel supply running dangerously low, Castro ordered 118 factories to be closed and sent thousands of Cuban doctors to Venezuela by the early 2000s in exchange for oil imports. In the late 1990s, speculation began to arise over Castro's age and well-being. Numerous health problems have been reported over the years, the most significant occurring in 2006 when Castro underwent surgery for gastrointestinal bleeding. In a dramatic announcement the same year, Castro designated his brother Raul as the country's temporary leader. Raul has served as Castro's second-in-command for decades. Finally, in 2008, 81-year-old Castro permanently gave up the Cuban presidency due to his deteriorating physical condition, and he handed over power to Raul, who was 76 years old at the time. In his retirement, Castro published his autobiography, My Life, in 2000, which offers a fascinating insight into the mind of the commander-in-chief, where his autobiography was used in this video. Though not involved in the day-to-day affairs of running Cuba, Castro still maintained a certain degree of political influence, both at home and abroad. However, when Obama became the first sitting American president to visit Cuba in almost 90 years, he did not meet with Castro, who later denounced the Goodwill Mission in his column, citing mistrust of U.S. motivations and writing, quote, "We don't need the empire to gift us anything." Castro died on November 25, 2016, at the age of 90 of natural causes. His brother and successor Raul made the heartbreaking announcement of his death on Cuban state television. Following Castro's death, Cuba declared 9 days of mourning. Thousands of Cubans lined up to pay tribute to their leader in Havana. Finally, on December 4, 2016, Castro's remains were buried at the Santa Ifigenia Cemetery in Santiago. While there was mourning in Havana, Cuban exiles around the world celebrated the death of the man they believed was a tyrant, who was responsible for killing and imprisoning thousands of Cubans and separating generations of family.
For the better or the worse, Fidel Castro remains one of history's most polarizing figures. On one hand, his struggle against the oppression of the Batista regime and US imperialist policies earned him wide acclaim as an ardent revolutionary, while on another, his brutal autocratic methods earned him many enemies amongst both the Cuban people and the neighboring countries, as evident by the CIA's adamant attempts to overthrow Fidel, the man who, unlike his comrade Che, simply refused to perish assassinated. If you liked this video, consider subscribing to spread history. This has been the Historiographer in collaboration with Stoic historian and TsarIvan. For now, have a good one.